I think it's a combination of these detailed models and these simple models that really gives sort of like a, because the detailed models are needed to maybe make sure to make contact with experiments, and but they are not sufficient alone to give you that insight. It's not like you can sort of just look at these traces and say, oh, there's a Higgs boson. You have to simulate the whole experiment. You have to do the measurement physics, and so it's just like a separate thing. And that sort of this measurement physics has been sort of, I think, underdeveloped in computational neuroscience. I think actually when it comes to simulations like our kinds of studies, a quantitative difference would make a qualitative difference in terms of what we could explore.
That's the hope anyway, right?
Yeah, that's a hope.
This is Brain Inspired.
Hello, everyone. I'm Paul. So on the last episode, I had Noah Hutton on to talk about his documentary film In Silico, which chronicles Henry Markram's quest to simulate a human brain under the project names the Blue Brain Project and the Human Brain Project. By coincidence, as you'll hear, today I have Gaute Einevoll on the podcast. Gaute is a professor at the University of Oslo and Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and he happens to have been part of the Human Brain Project since its inception in 2013. Gaute focuses on what he calls measurement physics in biologically realistic simulations of neural networks. His goal in the simulations is to faithfully predict or recreate the various types of signals that neuroscientists measure in real brains, signals like spikes and local field potentials, EEG and MEG. As you probably know, one of the grand achievements in neuroscience is the famous work by Hodgkin and Huxley in the 1950s, working out the dynamics equations that govern the activity of single neurons, which has led to tons of productive neuroscience. As Gaute points out, we still haven't had the same success simulating networks of neurons, and his hope is that by doing so, we can use the simulation models as tools to better understand networks of neurons across multiple scales and levels of biological detail, and to test hypotheses then about these networks. So we discuss all of that and more, and you can learn more about Gaute and his work in the show notes at braininspired.co/podcast/148, where you can also learn how to support this here podcast, to get all the full episodes and to join our Discord community, or to take my online course, NeuroAI, The Quest to Explain Intelligence, which is all about the intersection of neuroscience and current AI. Okay, without further ado, here's Gaute. So Gaute, the genesis for our conversation today was an email that you sent in response to a conversation I had with Carina Curto about the difference between beautiful and quote-unquote ugly models. And I feel bad for her because this was like a 2-page thing that she wrote a while ago in response to what neuroscience needs. She was asked to write this, she kind of backtracked also on the ugly part because and you in your email called them messy, which was a messy kinds of models. So
that's I mean, for first I should say it was a quite friendly email. This was
very friendly,
very friendly email. So this is sort of and I sort of understand what is meant by. And especially these beautiful models, because I think she had this nice example of the Hopfield network, which is clearly a beautiful model. It's sort of quite easy to write down. It has some beautiful mathematical properties, and it tells you something about you get some intuition about it. I actually I was at one of my first meetings I attended in neuroscience there was just after I switched to neuroscience from condensed matter physics. So John Hopfield was there. This was in Sweden. So I asked him about the role, what role his model would have, and he said it might be a metaphor for how the brain works, or how memory works, and that was very nice. That's of course what it could be. So I think we all agree that this was a very useful model, and it's certainly beautiful also. And then you have this other extreme where you have this complicated models or messy models. And, so I guess the most value neutral thing is to say complicated models, but I'm not very, so ugly is sort of...
Ugly has it's a negative connotation.
Yeah. But I mean, it's sort of, I think we all agree that it is, in some sense, ugly compared to the beautiful models. Because they have so many more parameters and much more difficult to understand. And in physics, some people sort of call this kind of model as like what's called number crunching, and they're doing this kind of modeling just for number crunching. And they sort of look down at some theoretical chemist for sometimes doing this kind of what they call number crunching. So, but I think it's obviously these ugly models have an important role to play.
I would hope you think that.
Together with it.
I would hope that you think that, given your work.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not because I think they have some special interest that they particularly, find them less ugly than other people do, but it's just that I think this is an important type of model we need in order to make progress.
Yeah, so the other thing that was kind of fortunate, and we're going to talk about some of your complicated models and the approach, and the other thing that was fortunate is that just this last episode, I interviewed Noah Hutton, who made this movie, this documentary In Silico about the Human Brain Project, by which you received at least some of your funding, and you've been involved with the Human Brain Project since its inception, so you got to see the film also, and we don't need to talk about it for long, but I'm just curious about your reactions to the film, which you were not in, by the way.
No. So that's true. I've been in the Human Brain Project, still in the Human Brain Project since its start in 2013, and I think it was an interesting movie, and certainly Markram himself is a very interesting character.
Yeah.
So I think it was, and I also heard your podcast, your live podcast or podcast with the audience. That was very.
I wanted to share that with you.
And so that was very nice, and I think Noah came across as a very reasonable person. So I guess my only, if you say, criticism is of the movie is that it didn't take the grasp at the opportunity to clear up the difference between the Blue Brain Project and the Human Brain Project, because Go ahead. So he mentioned it a little bit in the movie, but he sort of says that because these are very different projects, and some of these more, you say, grandiose claims of Markram has to do with the Blue Brain Project. If you look at the goal of the Blue Brain Project started, I guess, around 2005, and Markram had this TED talk in 2009, and then the Human Brain Project started in 2013, and this was not the continuation of the Blue Brain Project. They had a different goal. It was about making the infrastructure, or making it possible to simulate large scale networks on the computers and make this available for the community. And that was one of the goals. There were also other goals of the project. So, but this has often people have criticized the Human Brain Project and held it to the goals of the Blue Brain Project. And that has been and that I think, that In Silico didn't really take the opportunity to take advantage of the possibility to actually clear that up. Because I think much of the criticism and this petition that was signed against the Human Brain Project was based on people who mixed it up with the Blue Brain Project. So, and this was, there was also now I'm a little bit, because this is a sore point for us Human Brain Projectors, that it was also a critique in the, I think, Atlantic, a paper, an article there.
Ed Young, I think.
We also did, exactly, Ed Young, who did this, mixed it up in the same way. So, and the Human Brain Project is still running. That is, as also was said in the movie, but the goal is quite different. The goal is actually now one of the goals that we are very busy working on is to contribute to make this this computer, this infrastructure for doing large-scale simulations so that people can actually be able to do this kind of simulations without having access to a supercomputer by themselves and also so it's in some sense democratizing simulation science is that if you have a laptop computer somewhere, you should be able to sort of go in and run these large-scale models and do research on them using these sort of like supercomputers at different places in Italy, Spain, Germany, and France, and so on. So that is really the goal. And that's this kind of tools are now collected under this umbrella eBrains, which then we hope, the plan is that this will certainly continue beyond 2023. So I really hope that this will both be successful in the sense that it's going to be easy to use, and also that we're going to get user to at least the people who want to do this kind of large scale simulations, that they were able to find this useful and use it. I think it's going to be, so it's more about the tool than the model in some sense.
So the Human Brain Project ends in 2023, but you think that the funding will stay strong to continue these types of large-scale simulation projects?
I don't really know. I mean, we're actually, we are applying now for a much, much smaller project, sort of to just maintain and sort of like develop and make it like it's smooth, this, like the use of these tools that's been developed as part of the Human Brain Project. So we're literally writing a proposal now to the EU and hopefully that will, but that would just be a small fraction of the funding for the Human Brain Project.
Do you think that, what effect, if at all, do you think that documentary could have on the future funding of your flavor of science?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it would have been really helpful if this misunderstanding had been sort of cleared up. I think that has been because this obviously this thing of this whole reaction to the Human Brain Project has certainly hurt neuroscience, I think, because I mean I think I think that's
yeah. Do you think some of the reaction simply stems from jealousy, perhaps envy?
I don't know. I think it's also that somehow this strong claims that maybe Marker made sort of rub people the wrong way, and I sort of also didn't sort of, I believe I agreed partially with with his vision, but not completely. But it wasn't really that. I mean, it in some sense it was a lot of money, right? But it was also spread on like hundreds of labs. So we had, I think I had 2-3 people working in the group because of this. So it was was like an R01. So it was, or whatever. I mean, like a rather modest. So, but obviously I think it's this, when you see this, I think the neuroscience community, you see all this money and it's a big sum and it goes to a sort of another type of neuroscience, and they maybe don't sort of, even though it was an IT project. So I don't know. It was obviously, there's always some worries. I think everybody, especially in neuroscience, where there's so many approaches to neuroscience these days. So I think, of course, the approach I do is very promising. So I should get get sufficient funding, and everyone in neuroscience is feeling like this. So I guess there's always, also this worry about getting funded for your own approach.
Yeah, but last question about this, and then we can move on to more fruitful topics. Have you personally received pushback from the community, like any part of the community, or do you feel supported within the neuroscience community, or what's the general feeling you have?
No, I certainly hasn't been a particular pushback. I also been a little bit never been in the leadership of the Human Brain Project, and I think so I've been a little bit on the periphery. I worry, however, maybe some of these more grandiose claims, maybe that was people got the impression from like presentation of the Blue Brain Project, is that if you sort of just make a very complicated model and put a bunch of like detailed neuron models in a network and simulate on a supercomputer, then voila, you sort of, the spirit comes out of the bottle. If that is sort of like this very naive thing that I don't think anybody believed, at least sort of not anybody I know. I mean, this kind of, you have such a model, it's sort of like a starting point for doing research. It's not the end of it. And it's, so there's all these unknown parameters, which is also pointed out, by like some of the people who were interviewed in Silico, which I think is a very, very good point, that you don't know the parameters. But the way to find the parameters is to build sort of what I call a skeleton model, and then sort of use that to sort of try to compare with data and so on. But it's not so anyway, so I think sometimes when you present this and maybe apply for money, people have this sort of conception of that we have this naive vision that if you just make a very messy model and it looks sort of realistic, that somehow it's going to act realistically. And I think that's not how it works.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so you detail, well, in this review paper, the scientific case for brain simulations, which was a 2019 review paper, I believe. You talk about this approach and why it's supported, and also, like you alluded to before, that it's going to take a lot of different labs, a lot of different people working on it, spread out, and that we have the capabilities of doing that these days with supercomputers that you can send your data off to, and it runs on a supercomputer in some other country or something. So maybe you can just kind of give an overview of what your approach is, and then why. So it's cool that you think it's important for these models to be able to predict not only spiking activity, but local field potentials, EEG signals, fMRI, and these all come with their own challenges, of course. But maybe you can kind of broadly overview what you're doing and the goal.
The overall approach, I think, is very similar to like the approach of Hodgkin and Huxley when they modeled a neuron, or actually a piece of the neuron, the axon. So they just looked at it as a physical system, right? They made a model for the axon, and then they used all kinds of clever experiments to design this model and determine parameters and run it on computer eventually, right? So,
but they didn't have a computer, right? So they had to do this gut wrenching hand calculations.
No, that was extremely impressive in so many along so many different axes.
Yeah.
So now after that, we now have a pretty good idea about how to model single neurons, right? We have this cable equation, you have this what called you can do this reconstructed morphology with dendrites and so on. So we can make sort of like the structure. We know the dendrites, and we can make mathematical models. We have the mathematical framework. What is hard though is to find the parameters. What sort of ion channel densities should you put in the soma? Is it IH? Is it more along the like apical dendrite and the basal? All these choices, right? So then you have to you do as many measurements as you can in some sense. Often this patch electrodes, and now people are also starting to use extracellular recordings if you have these neurons on like this microelectrodes arrays and so on. And then you have all this experimental data, and then you sort of fit the model parameters to make this neuron model that you make predict as accurately as possible these like the behavior of this. Make the model behave as similar as what you see in experiments. And there's many types of experiments and so on. And already there you have this problem that it's not a unique solution. It's not like it's one set of parameters that this gives the uniquely best fit. And I think already there was this one model that we use a lot was we called it the Hay model, because the first author was Itai Hay. It was like from 2011. I think it was in a group of Idan Segev. So there they had like this beautifully multi-compartment detailed neural model, but they had one sort of example parameter set they used throughout the paper, or a couple of them, but they also gave up 500 other parameter sets which did equally well. So that already like this thing that about model solution degeneracy, which is another thing to discuss. But we are essentially trying to do the same thing for a network, because if you look at network studies, especially in the cortex, there are no examples that I know of like a piece of cortex for a particular biological system that has been like made so that you can sort of essentially this network model can mimic a bunch of different experiments. And we are now working with collaborators at the Allen Institute, particularly Anton Arkhipov and Christoph Koch, on sort of as you know, they have done a lot of, the Allen Institute has focused a lot on the mouse visual cortex over the last decade and mapped out all kinds of things, and also then made this like first version of a network model. But then of course, how do you constrain this? How do you determine the parameters of this model? And that's a huge challenge. But again, you have to use experiments, not only spikes, but also other experiments. So that's in fitting these complex models, these ugly models to experiments, you need to take advantage of all experiments available. So that is sort of where but that was the same thing if you look at Hodgkin and Huxley, they did all kinds of different manipulations with patch clamping, with space clamping. And so they did all kinds of manipulations to get a rich sort of set of experiments, which they use. So I would say it's very much the same spirit as Hodgkin and Huxley.
Yeah, well, maybe we should talk about the degeneracy. So I had Eve Martyr, and she's, become this famous figure in neuroscience, showing that there are 1,000 different ways to skin a cat in the stomatogastric ganglion of lobsters and crabs. So how, and I know that you see rightly so, see the degeneracy as a feature and not a bug of the system. But how much do you worry that that it will have an impact on the relevance of the brain simulations that you perform?
No, this is a major worry, of course. So then you have to do this thing that you sort of say you fit your model to one type of data. For example, when it comes to like this mouse visual cortex model that has been developed at the Allen Institute, they have all these beautiful experiments where they show these different kinds of like images and movies and spots and whatever visual stimuli to the mouse, and so you can sort of in some sense fit the model to data for one type of experiments and then test it on others, and so on. But I think also it's an important thing to what does this degeneracy mean? Because I think, obviously this wonderful podcast, by the way, I'm a big fan. I think you're doing a good service to the field.
But by the way, I should say we should plug your podcast, Sense and Science, right? So it's largely in go ahead, in Norwegian.
So that's true. So I have this Norwegian. Essentially, it's a podcast where most of the episodes are in Norwegian, but there are some of them are made in English. I think it's 4 or 5 or something, and with some neuroscientists, and that's called it's found on the Sense and Science. So that's.
And you got true. Terry Sanowski to laugh a lot more than I did, so nice job. It was he was generous with the laughter. It was great.
So that's true. So Terry Sanowski is there, and Christoph Koch is there, and I also had Sean Carroll. He's not a neuroscientist, but I think he's a wonderful podcaster. So I really like. I'm only a Patreon subscriber to podcasts. It's yours and his. So that's.
Oh man, my heart, heart is a flutter.
Exactly. No, that's true. And I actually tell my students sort of listen to this podcast because it's, following up. Well, even reading papers within your own field is quite sort of like, as you know, quite challenging. But you sort of having listened to a 1 hour, 2 hour podcast where you interview someone. So like in especially this AI thing, which is a little bit like adjacent to what I do, but certainly not interested in it.
We're gonna come back to that.
It.
Yeah.
So this is sort of it's been very useful for me just to stay oriented in the field. But what I was saying is that if you look at this deep networks, say the ones that can be the normal deep sort of convolutional networks that can be used for like image recognition. If you sort of train, say if you took like 2 identical identical networks, or like to start off with, and then you train that, but maybe with a different initial conditions, or maybe with a different order of images or something.
Yeah.
Then you will end up with two networks which are probably behaving the same way, performing the same way, and both are sort of hopefully then successful. But if you go into the detailed parameters and you look at the synaptic connections or the connections, right, they will be different.
Yeah.
So in some sense, this tells that it's not the detailed connections that matter. It's some kind of more like some kind of average thing in the connection, whatever, some other measure of the connection that matters. And so that's also not a unique solution. So I think this thing of looking for a unique solution is something we're so used to, because that's typically how we made our models. We want to make them sort of low dimensional, I guess what's it called, so that you have few parameters and then you sort of try to find this sort of set the parameters so that in some sense gives the most like suitable behavior. But that's just like, that's a special case. And even if you looked at like the Hodgkin and Huxley, if they, instead of fitting ion channel densities, if they started sort of to fit sort of positions of individual ion channels,
Jesus,
then you would end up with the same kind of degeneracy of solution. So this degeneracy is just it just has to do with how the resolution we use when we model.
Well, and of course, your brain and my brain, we both can speak English, and your English is probably better than mine because, multilingual and you're just bright.
Yeah.
But, of course, our brains are not parameterized the exact same way, nor is the structure the exact same way, et cetera.
Exactly.
But, you mentioning convolutional neural networks, so the hope is that you can extract some principle out of, how it's doing what it's doing. And in the case of convolutional neural networks, those principles are, well, you need multiple layers, you need the convolutions to form abstractions. So I don't know if you want to say, so I guess I just wanted to throw that out there to you. And, how do you think about extracting, I guess, abstract principles from these detailed model simulations? In the face of degeneracy.
So that's obviously, I think the first step is trying to find this very complicated model, and how do you do, and what we're after, we often call this like trying to find what's called a multi-purpose model, a model that can explain many things at the same time. Because that typically, if you look at some of these earlier works on the modeling the visual system, there are like these firing rate models, which I think are sort of showing some things like whatever, it's like this constant invariance and like responses to visual stimuli with the contrast invariance, I mean. So there are certainly things, but they typically can only explain one thing at the time, but they're still useful. They explain that thing. And if you try it on something else, whatever, orientation selectivity or direction selectivity, it doesn't work, right? And it's not surprising, right? Because you need probably a complex model if you want to have this multi-purpose model. That, say, if you had like a model of the mouse visual cortex, that should be able to reproduce, within some accuracy, responses to different visual stimuli, and also maybe different brain states, like the mouse is like active or resting, and so that would be sort of like a multi-purpose model, and that sort of is, and so then of course then there's also a question what you do with what kind of model are you after? Are you going to actually the data from the Allen Institute? They have not only a beautiful model, they also have this beautiful electrophysiological and optophysiological data. So they have data from 50 mice, and when you look at them, even in the visual system, if you look at the spike patterns and also like the what we call local field potential, these other things, they are quite different from mouse to mouse. So they probably also vary there's all kind of variability. So you have to think about, do I want to make a model for an average mouse or some kind of individual mouse, or what are you really? So there's all these these issues. But say if you have this sort of like multi-purpose detailed model that is able to predict all these all these different experimental observation for the particular mouse, that would certainly not be the end of the project. Some people say that's just as complicated as a real mouse almost, and that's true. But then you have this perfect, I guess, what's called a white box, a white mouse. No, well, that's probably not a, but anyway, a network that, yeah, whatever. So they call about the black box and the white box, right? So this would be analogous to a white box mouse where you can actually do all kinds of experiments, right? So you can sort of then start looking for principles, and so then that would be a very nice starting point, I think, for making more simplified models at different sort of coarse grain levels. I mentioned in this, I think we mentioned in this paper in Neuron about the scientific case for brain simulations, that you can sort of maybe then, in addition to having this biophysically detailed model, biophysically detailed network model, you can also have maybe network models of point neurons, like integrated fire type neurons, and also then maybe in terms of like firing rates or population firing rates. And you would like these to be sort of linked together in a systematic way, so that you can, under some approximations, be able to sort of derive the model at the more coarse-grained level from the lower level, right? So it's the starting point in some, so it's not the end point.
So, and then be able to extract some principles from comparing the different granularity models.
And that would, of course, be... Yeah?
Go ahead, please.
I'm thinking... Yeah, sorry. So, no, because I'm in there's all this, if you think of all the models that have come about, a good suggestion for like principles for how the brain works. You have like the, predictive coding and thousand brains theory, and like this inside out perspective of Bouchaki. Which are all interesting, right? But some of them have been around for a long time, and it's just very difficult to find out which of those, if any, is correct, right? So
all.
All, maybe. Exactly.
Maybe there's a degeneracy there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then at least if you could then, someone who believes in one of these sort of try to make actually a model based on these, because we know quite a bit about sort of how to make, we know quite a bit about the structure of the mouse or the visual cortex, right? In terms of the neurons, and that they are connected. We don't know how strong these connections are, and so we certainly don't know all the parameters, and obviously we don't know this plasticity rules either. But nevertheless, there are some constraints, right? So if there's one of these IDs that easily can sort of be accommodated with this structure, that adds the credence of that ID. And if there's another ID which is much more difficult to fit with this, what we know about the structure and this type of models, then it's sort of like less credence. So that would be certainly a way to sort of to also get hopefully closer to these principles.
Well, but you view these models not as hypotheses, but as tools, right? I don't know if you want to just comment about that, because I think some of the criticism is based on that notion, like, well, what will these models be testing? Like what's the question, right? Yeah. But the whole point, I suppose, not to put words in your mouth, is that they're question agnostic tools.
Yeah, exactly. So that's how I think about it. Say if you have this, you're out there. That's I like to hike in the mountains like many Norwegians do. And say if I get an idea, I believe this M channel is very important to get the hippocampal circuit to function. And I do get that out hiking. And then I get back to my little cabin and then sort of do something with the M thing and get the M channel and then simulate it down on some supercomputer in whatever, Lugano or whatever, right? So that you can test that, what are consequences of that? So that's how it's a tool for testing hypotheses. It's not a hypothesis in itself. And I think my background before I came into neuroscience was in solid state physics, where I worked with like materials. And there we know how to, in some sense, we have the fundamental principle for solving materials. We just have to put all these atoms into sort of like the grid or like the whatever, like the structure that we know is there, the lattice structure. And then we have to solve the Schrödinger equation, this quantum mechanical equation for the electrons. And that's a very complicated equation to solve. But nevertheless, we know that if you're able to solve it, then sort of that sort of gives you it's a close approximation of the truth. So that's, and that's the same thing that, that's very useful, but it's not the end of the story. You don't really understand you need additional simpler theories to understand particular phenomena, like, for example, superconductivity. Some materials can conduct electricity without any resistance, and that some materials are semiconductors, others are metals, and so on. So you need also these other, like, what are coarse grain theories, but I think it's a combination of these detailed models and these simpler models that really gives sort of like because the detailed models are needed to make contact with experiments, but they are not sufficient alone to give you that insight.
Okay, well, maybe just coming back to the models that you work with. So one of the goals, and I guess the main goal, is for the model to predict all these various types of signals, like I was mentioning earlier.
Yes.
And I guess you started off with wanting to predict local field potentials because, I guess to give it away, you found that a model that predicts the spiking activity of a network doesn't necessarily predict the local field potentials of the network. So talk about that and why it's important, you think, to come up with these equations, like you were saying in solid state physics, to make predictions about the neural measurement signals that we measure.
I think so. I mean, if you look at the systems neuroscience, right, all the insights we have from studying systems has been from measuring spikes, the extracellular signatures of action potentials.
I generally threw my local field potentials away. Yeah,
exactly. And I think there was also, like, I guess historically there were two reasons. I mean, you couldn't store them all, so because you didn't have cheap hard drives and stuff. But maybe that's not the problem now. But obviously there was in some sense we were a little bit blissed in neuroscience that the spikes are so easy to interpret, right? You know that they are from action potentials of neurons in the neighborhood. And so that's why this is typically what you measure and analyze, right?
But
this is at the heart of it. Yeah.
You've made the point also, though we're still not confident that we understand the quote unquote code of spikes, whether it matters the timing between them, the firing rate, the overall firing rate, etc. So we're not that comfortable even with spikes.
No. But I guess we do believe that if I knew all the spikes in the brain of an animal, then we have all we need to understand in principle the information flow, or if you're just very clever and figure things out.
Yeah.
So that I think is also true. So if you sort of look just for the history of spikes, right? It's receptive fields that was sort of like the Jubel and Wiesel and obviously told us a lot about neural representations. And now we have with these manifolds, these neural manifolds, which is also obviously a nice way to look at this, which also tells us things. But from the point of view of falsifying models, say if you measure spikes and LFPs, local field potentials, just to make sure that, the local field potentials in the cortex is measured from the same electrode. It's just a low frequency part. So maybe the part below a few hundred hertz. And then the spikes are actually extracted from the high frequency part above a few hundred hertz. So it's the same electrode. It's just that it's like a different aspect of the signal. And the
local field potential, just to carry on with what you were doing, which I should do more often to describe what we're actually talking about. The local field potential has traditionally been thought to measure the synaptic input to the neurons and a broader scope than of course a spike, which is the output of a neuron.
Exactly. And I think that is still true in many situations. That's true. We're actually writing a book now on electrical signals of the brain, which hopefully come out next year on Cambridge. So where we go through what I call the measurement physics, the link between what the neurons or our group goes through, what the link between the neurons are doing and what you would measure in terms of spikes and local field potential and EEG and ECOG and also MEG. And so on. So, but it's the thing. So the thing is that with the thing is that if a local field potential, even with the best electrodes, that you have, say, the neuropixel probe, that is like they're using at the Allen Institute. Well, it's used all over the world now. You can only measure, say, like, I think if you have one of these neuropixel probes, that's a multi-shank, multi-electrode that has like many contacts. But even that you can sort of impale quite deep into the cortex and cover lots of mouse visual cortex and well, mouse brain altogether. You can only measure about 70, 80 neurons, spikes from 70, 80 neurons at a time from each of these shanks.
You say only,
so if you want to,
back in the day when you could only measure one, it's much more enticing.
That's true. So it's only compared if you want to use this data to constrain a network model. So so that's sort of the key thing, that if you want to constrain a network model, say if you have this model with many, well, thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, well, a few tens of thousands, 100,000 neurons mimicking a piece of visual cortex, it's certainly the spiking data are important, but they're quite erratic and stochastic. So it's a lot of variations of that model that will be compatible with the experiments that you have on spikes. And that's where you come in with, if the same model can predict not only spikes, but also other things, that the local field potential, then you put more constraints on. So that is sort of the why, like, one of the reasons I'm very interested in local field potential, and it's also ECOG and EEG, that to be able to predict all these different measures from the same physical model. So it's sort of, yeah. So that is sort of
Does that have a touch point with thinking in terms of one mouse versus average mouse, that LFP signals essentially would also get us closer to the average mouse?
Yes, I think that's certainly also true. Yes, and I think also if you just look at a single mouse, one trial versus another trial for the same mouse, Right. So everything is just more or less varied, because it's what is. You said that the LFP is sort of reflects the synaptic inputs to neurons, and these synaptic inputs, of course, comes from presynaptic spikes. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, the local field potential is sort of like some kind of weighted average of spikes, just a different kind of weighted average. So in some sense, it captures a lot of the spiking going on in the network in an indirect way. So right. it's sort of like some sense so that's and there's the thing. If you want to compute the local field potential, say what does the contribution to the local field potential from a neuron that gets a synaptic input, say at the apical dendrite, what does it look like? If you want to model that, you cannot use a point neuron model, because a point neuron model doesn't generate an extracellular potential. And it turns out that this contribution to the local field potential, that depends on the morphology and where the synapses are. And then you need to use these biophysical detailed models. And actually, if you want to do this measurement physics properly, that's not only for the electric measures like spike, LFP, EEG, ECOG, or the magnetic measures, particularly MEG, but also for the optical measure, like the response to voltage sensitive dye imaging and so on. That very much depends on. Then you need these biophysically detailed models. So to make this proper measurement physics link, then you need these biophysically detailed models. Even if you sort of maybe can get away with simpler models to get an idea about like how the information flows in the network. If you want to sort of to translate it into the things you measure, you need to go via this sort of like biophysically detailed models. And so that's something that we have worked quite a bit on, doing this kind of making these practical tricks for making that possible. So that you can sort of compute EEG contributions from a network model, even of point neurons, or even firing rate models. So it's sort of this more mundane thing of doing the measurement physics. I sometimes compare it to the discovery of the Higgs boson in CERN, Switzerland, because there you had, if you look at the people at CERN, they had maybe like 20, 30 people, I don't know, who worked on why there should be a Higgs boson in the first place, right? That has to do with the standard theory, quarks, and the standard theory of particle physics. But then it's like, okay, so, but then most of the people work on how can you measure this Higgs boson, right? It's not like you can sort of just look at these traces and say, oh, there's a Higgs boson. You have to simulate the whole experiment. You have to do the measurement physics. And so it's just like a separate thing. And that's sort of this measurement physics has been sort of, I think, underdeveloped in computational neuroscience. Most people have worked on sort of this information processing and seeing how spikes generate new spikes and so on, which I understand because this is sort of the most interesting thing. But if you don't do this measurement physics correctly, then you're going to make incorrect sort of like comparisons with experiments. So there's many examples of people who haven't papers who are sort of not very valuable when they're compared with experiments because they've forgotten this sort of basic, or they haven't done the measurement physics thing. So that's one of the reasons we do this sort of like model the potentials. There's also this other thing that, people obviously measure local field potential and ECOG and EEG. And what do they do with them? Well, typically they do statistical analysis of some sort, right? And then try to interpret this data in terms of some kind of underlying neural activity. And how do you test these data analysis methods? I think it's always a good, like a sane approach if you can make some good benchmarking data where you know the ground truth. And if you have sort of like a test circuit, we'd say like a piece of mouse visual cortex, even if it's not, fine-tuned to correspond to one particular mouse, in that sense, not very realistic. It's still probably good enough to test a method for example, what's called current source density analysis, which should work for also unrealistic models or unrealistic mice. It doesn't depend on, so I think depend on sort of being biologically accurate. So I think that's a very important, and we have used that actually to test sort of different. We have also developed some new methods for current source density analysis back in the past, and they were tested on model-based benchmarking data. And I think this is also important for developing automatic spike sorters. I guess you were sort of in your,
I don't want to talk about it.
You had to do, I know. That's sort of, exactly. So this is sort of, I'm in Oslo at this, called the Center for Integrated Neuroplasticity. So we have modelers and experimentalists sitting side by side. So we also look at these people doing spike sorting, right? And all the issues related to that. And it's like, so that's extremely, So having automated, validated spike sorting methods I can trust, that'd be very useful to the field, right? So, and I think then you need ground truth data. You could get it two ways. If you have dual recordings, say like measure spikes and maybe optical responses to 2-photon calcium imaging or something. But that's sort of quite hard to get by and to at least get a lot of this kind of data. But with model-based data, I think the modeling of these extracellular signals are quite well established. So I sort of so I think it's the modeling formalism you can trust.
Yeah, the spike sorting thing, I'll just make one further comment on that. That has become more important with these high-density multi-electrode recording techniques because back in the old day, when I started, you could, with a single electrode, everything drifts while you're recording. So you could kind of chase that neural signal and be confident that you're still recording the same neuron. But you can't do that with these multi-electrode systems. And there's questions about you impale the cortex, right, or put it down into the brain, and then this is talking a little shop, and then you wait and you go get a coffee because that it's going to drift over time, and so you want it to be as stable as possible, but it's never completely stable. So there are different ideas about how long to wait and so on. So anyway,
but you were working with monkeys, right?
Monkeys, yeah.
Yeah,
but they were head fixed, and so they weren't freely behaving in that sense. But still, there's drift. Yeah. So anyway, just a side
actually
note.
About this, the usefulness for modeling signals. I think you had a nice podcast with your old postdoc advisor Jeffrey Shaw.
Oh,
right?
yeah. He was my advisor when I did a postdoc with him.
So he referred to this work with our Jorge Riera and others down in Florida.
They work on that.
Using,
yeah.
So I was, so I know this. So they are doing some very nice work using actually some of our tools. So
I was wondering about that.
So exactly. So this is Jorge is a great guy, and Jeffrey also. I'm quite sure. I just haven't met him in person. But Jorge he's been visiting a few times. So it's not so, computational neuroscience community is sort of not so big compared to the neuroscience community.
Right.
And within the computational neuroscience community, there's like the people who model signals are, it's a minority of the minority.
Fraction,
so like Jorge Riera is one of them, right? But more and more people are, I think, that's what we always say when you sort of want to promote your approach or tell about your approach. But I think more and more people are sort of, if you want to go beyond this sort of, I would say like anecdotal understanding of networks, I think there's been some very beautiful model studies of learning about how principles for how networks may operate, how to get the dynamics. Maybe particularly this one example is this balanced excitation inhibition ID. Which was beautifully demonstrated 25 years ago in a more generic network, like simple neurons. And we have learned a lot from those. But if you want to make sort of not what are like these generic studies, go beyond that and make models for particular systems, particular like pieces of cortex or particular systems, then you have to sort of look into, then you have to sort of do this measurement physics more properly. Even though there's, I think, obviously you mentioned Eve Marder and the work of, her work, obviously, or the work in her group on this what is stomatogastric ganglion. Yeah, it's certainly very beautiful, and it has, it's very important and has obviously illustrated the many of the same issues that we have to address in computation when you're dealing with cortex. I would say though that I think life, if we get stronger computers, say like if we get this, like the e-brains, there's like the infrastructure following the Human Brain Project, so that you can sort of run decently large network models and run them for a long time. Then we can start also exploring like plasticity rules, because actually coming out from Eve Marder's lab, there are this sort of beautiful work on homeostasis. Why does a layer 5 neuron in the cortex know that it's a layer 5 neuron? What happens? And it turns out, of course, and it was like also beautiful work. I remember by one of our postdocs, Tim O'Leary, I think he's now at Cambridge, where this showed how sort of you can sort of, instead of fitting channel densities in neuron models, you can sort of essentially just let them tune themselves using this essentially like plasticity rules based on the intercellular calcium concentration. And then suddenly you have changed the parameter fitting from channel densities to essentially fitting these plasticity rules. So it might get much simpler. And it's the same thing with, there was also this beautiful work from the group of Wolfram Gelsner, and that was like 10 years ago, where they showed how you could get to this balanced state without having to fine tune and to get these right parameters. You could have this particular synaptic plasticity rule. I think it was an inhibitory of synaptic plasticity, which let the network tune itself. So I think it's and that's closer to what the real brain does, I'm quite sure. And it will make life easier if we just are able to run the models longer so that we can use these rules.
So you make these, complicated high parameter models, and I know you make them at different, levels of abstraction as well, and then you can compare between them. But how long are we talking? Do you run your simulations? So it's not long enough for a sort of a plasticity allowance.
No. So typically they are run for a few seconds of biological time, even though we haven't really pushed that. And so far we haven't looked. I think we can sort of add short-term plasticity, that is something we could add to the model, and that could maybe give, add something to it. But these sort of more, this homeostatic plasticity and synaptic, like long-term like long-term synaptic plasticity, it's not something that we can do. And they are obviously, I think, hopefully that will make our life easier when in the future we can actually explore these things in models and I think it's going to make the parameter fitting problem.
But you could potentially do that right now. So a lot of what you do is model multi-compartment neurons where you're breaking down the neural structure into like lots and lots of different sections. But you also test dual compartment, right? Where you have an apical area and a basal soma area.
Yes,
and
two compartment we call it, yeah.
Two compartment, yeah. You could potentially already, I mean, but they're not as computationally costly to run, right? So you could potentially go down that avenue right now with those, right?
Exactly. So actually when it comes to this Allen mouse visual cortex model, they have like two versions. One with the biophysically detailed models in multi-compartment and one with point neurons. And we are actually using both. And actually when it comes, we have a lot of master students working on this model here, and they typically use this simpler point neuron version simply because then you can run it on like normal computers and you can sort of get feedback in. And I think it's true when it comes to synaptic plasticity and it's like effect of spiking, and sort of how self-tuning of these connection parameters. Then I think sort of actually exploring point neuron networks first is probably a right avenue. And people are doing that. I don't follow that field as closely as I should, but certainly that's important work there. And I think that's true. So you just have to be practical about it. But at the end of the day, you would like these different approximation schemes to be internally connected so that you don't just invent something that on a coarse grained level that could never happen for a real neuron, right? So it has to be some kind of consistency.
But even the multi-compartment neurons, that's a decision to make of how many compartments, because you're still, it's not biophysically equivalent to a real neuron. So, how does that decision get made, for instance?
I think typically the standard way is that you divide it up into these small sections, which are compartments. And the key thing is that the membrane potential within each compartment should be the same, meaning so there shouldn't be a potential difference within the compartment, which is sort of larger than some kind of fraction of it. So that's how we set it. So some say the compartment should be equipotential, as we say.
But then how
so
do you decide
a systematic way?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, so what was the question? How do we decide the size of the compartment, or?
Yeah, how do you decide how many compartments? I mean, I know sometimes you just kind of plug in, like with the Allen Institute model, you use other people's models also, and sometimes alter them, changing parameters. But
I think in Neuron, what they often do, Neuron is this simulation tool that is used still sort of like I guess the most used simulation tool where you can import these reconstructed morphologies of neurons into the model, and then it sort of compartmentalizes it itself. And then you have this, you have this measure called the electrotonic length. How fast does the potential, if you have this little piece of a cable, then you have this, what's called electrotonic length, which tells you how fast does the potential decay from one end of the cable to the other. And that depends on the diameter and like these things and their resistivity and so on. And if you say that, well, it shouldn't decay more than maximally, say, 1%. And that also depends on frequency. So you have some criteria like this that you can use to sort of to say. But again, what you typically do, what you could do if you're worried about this, you can sort of change it and make a more stringent criterion and see if the results you're interested in change. Right. So that's like, so that's sort of like, so there are like these approaches to at least to like have some sanity tests in the modeling, on the modeling itself.
All right. So in terms of, what you've been able to accomplish, you've been at this for quite some time. And I mentioned earlier that, and I think this is correct, that you started with trying to essentially predict LFPs and spiking, but LFPs was local field potentials was the problem. And I know that you are continuing to move into EEG signals, which has not been as much of a problem as the LFP was originally, if I understand correctly, and other types of signals. So, what lessons have we learned, or have you learned so far about the importance of being able to predict these signals?
Yeah, so I would say what we have done, I mean, we have worked on these signals for, I guess, 15 years or something. And most of them was sort of to look like what are called generic studies. So if you have a population of pyramidal neurons that receives a synaptic input, what really determines how strong the local field potential measured inside this population would be? I mean, and morphology is important, but what is also found is that it's really the distribution of synaptic inputs. I mean, it's like if it's homogeneously distributed, you get a very small LFP, even though the spiking resulting from this might be very high. Right. But it's just that you need this like asymmetry or unbalance in the input, sort of to, and then another thing we found out is that, or we explored systematically, I think people have sort of known this before, but I think we have done it, sort of taken it to a quantitative level, and the effects of correlations, how correlated the synaptic inputs are. So that really determines a lot. So say if you have so we had one paper that came out, I guess, 10 years ago or something, where we looked at how local the local field potential is. So if you put down an electrode, you know that, well, if you measure a spike or spikes, you know that they typically come from within 100 micrometers from the tip of the electrode. But what about the local field potential? And then experiments have sort of had very different estimates on that, all the way from like a few hundred micrometers to centimeters. And what we found by exploring it in a model is that this could be, that this what we call the spatial reach, very much depends on how correlated the inputs, the correlated to the different, well, the signals that to the neurons that sets up this LFP. So it's a little bit like if you have a microphone hanging over a football stadium, right? And then it's, if there's like small talk and nothing is happening, just boring, then you don't hear it very well. But if somebody scores a touchdown, right, you get this sort of some sense correlated cheer, and then you can hear it from outside the stadium, right? So it's a little bit the same kind of idea. If you have like this correlated neurons that's singing in synchrony, then you get a strong LFP. So anyway, so these are the kinds of studies that we have investigated. And also, for example, if you measure an LFP, is it necessarily due to neurons around the electrode? Or could it be this very loud neighboring population? And we have explored this quantitatively and learned, I think, a lot about how these sort of like, what really determines that competition. And then we have looked at sort of other aspect effect of active dendritic conductances, IH, for example, that you how will they affect things? So we have done studies like that. And now also, as I said, focus on EEG, because I mean, the traditional way one traditional way of analyzing EEG signals is to try to do sort of like estimate sources where there's like dipole sources, and that's like an ill-posed problem and very hard, but you can put the constraints. So there's a lot of work that has gone into this. And what we have done is, or to add to this, is that we now can actually compute the current. If you have a particular neuron population that gets a synaptic input at a certain place, we can compute the current dipole moments. So we can actually make that connection between the current dipole moment and what's actually going on in the circuit. So that sort of is sort of what we have worked a lot on, this, what's called the forward modeling of electrical signals. So I would say most of the work we have done has been on sort of finding these principles. What makes a large LFP? When is it large? When is it small? And also we have worked on making tests, like ways to make test data for spark sorting algorithms, sort of like different kinds of application of forward modeling, testing, data analysis methods, and so on. But now we are trying to I would say like the last couple of years in collaboration with Allen Institute, we're trying to use this to constrain and work towards this multi-purpose version of this mouse visual cortex model. So that is something. We had actually a couple of workshops that we have organized together with the Allen Institute, Anton Arkhipov. So if people are interested, they can look it up on the net and find some, they're out on YouTube, these things. So it's this goal of trying to make this multi-purpose model. And one important thing is that there's a lot of parameters, right? Obviously in this, and you can think in these models, and you say, well, with 5 parameters, you can fit an elephant, and right, with 6, you can make it blink or whatever. But that is for statistical models, right? When you just fit it to a mathematical function, fitting a curve to a mathematical function. But if you have these mechanistic models, it's like the physics type and the type of network models, and finding combination of connectivity, connection parameters and so on, that sort of makes the LFP look right is very hard. It's not like it's easy at all. So it's not like it's like many models that, at least at the present stage, the challenge is to find one model that actually is quite close to experiments. It's not that we have if we found one such model, we can sort of expand and find where it sort of is, find this parameter set. But it's not like it's many models. It's very easy to find a model that fits the experimental data because it's a mechanistic model. It's not a statistical model.
Well, so you've tested models with like a handful of neurons and, you're scaling up. How much of a problem is that aspect of it, of trying to find the right parameters for, let's say, an LFP signal or something like that as you scale up? And then what's your outlook on scaling these simulations up?
Yeah, in terms of one thing, the LFP is also it's a coarse-grained signal, right? So I think if you so it's not like you're moving one neuron around a little bit or changing a little. It sort of takes it's sort of the roar of the crowd in some sense, right? Yep. So and we haven't. So we have actually now. What we have done that's the last paper that is just coming out in. It's out on bioRxiv, coming out in PLOS. It's out in PLOS Computational Biology, where I looked at the trick for being able to, if you have even a firing rate model, when you model, say, populations, and say in a cortex, and then like laminarly organized set of populations, and being able to convert that into LFPs using a sort of like some tricks, what we call the kernel trick, so that we're able to actually to compute these signals without because if we want to do brute force, it's actually a quite additional. Well, it really is an additional load. So if you want to combine it with say firing rate models of like the neural field models, neural mass models, then you need to do some kind of trick to compute, say, the EEG contributions. And when you want to make a neural field model for the whole brain, predict EEG signals, then you need some kind of trick, and that is something we have worked on. So the limitation, one important thing is that finding a mouse visual cortex model, tuning the parameters so that it becomes multi-purpose is very hard. So that's going to keep us busy. It's not like an either-or thing either, right? We're going to hopefully get closer, more and more multi-purpose, and we don't really know how fast the progress will be, and so on. But that's a hard thing. If you have a model to compute this LFP and EEG and so on, that's very easy. The measurement physics is much easier than in some sense the network physics, if you see what I'm saying. So it's the limitation is actually being able to both make larger network models covering maybe cortical areas and actually whole cortices, and making it with sensible parameters so that actually it can actually predict. It's sort of similar, predict some of the things that of the experiments. That's sort of the hard thing, but going from that model to the EEG signals over the other signals is not so hard. And the first of going towards the human brain, it's obviously there's not only the problem of knowing enough about the neurons and particularly the connections, but it's also then a matter of scaling up and being able to run large enough network models that they sort of makes sense, that their network behavior sort of like resembles what you see in experiments. Of course, also in humans you have much less data because you only have you don't have it's like like essentially just EEG and MEG, right, which are non-invasive.
Yeah.
So, but I think maybe it's a little bit like if you sort of look at like deep networks again, convolution networks, the neuron dynamics that is typically assumed, right? You have like this linear threshold, these ReLU networks. So the neurons are sort of fixed, and you tune some synaptic weights. And I think with this, say with the mouse visual cortex, where they mapped out using this patch electrode, this automated way to find quite good neural models. I think the weakest link now is finding the synaptic connections. I think we're better off make some kind of automated procedure for getting at least decent neural models. So I think in our project, you often start with taking the neural models for granted, at least as a starting point, and then we have to deal with the synaptic connection weights.
Okay. So I just want to understand and reiterate I may be repeating what you've said earlier, but with something like predicting an LFP signal or figuring out how widespread you're recording in an LFP, the goal is not necessarily to understand the meaning of the LFP, but just to be able to get the models right, so that when you are testing these against experimental data, you have a well-constrained and built model, right? So it's not specific to interpretation of the signals you're recording. It is specific to the model as a tool.
That's true. Yeah. So it's a way, exactly. That's true. So it's a way to predict, given that you have your model, if you believe in your model, if that's your hypothesis, then what are the consequences in terms of what the LFP should look like?
Right.
And because I don't think there's this question whether local field potential has sort of actually feeds back to and modulates the dynamics. It could be, I don't know, it's not quite clear whether that is important in practice, but I look at LFP sort of like, I actually talked about Terry Sinofsky, and which I made laugh. He called LFP the exhaust fumes of the brain, which is some sense true. It's sort of, so it's more about what can you learn from the exhaust fumes, if that's the only thing you measure. So I think that's true. So if it's like a proxy for the spikes.
So
at least the way
So just to stick on LFPs for a moment, neural oscillations kind of waxes and wanes as a focus of neuroscience. Like you mentioned Bujaki, he's studied oscillations a lot. Is that something that is of interest to you to recapitulate oscillatory dynamics also?
For me, it's one of the features that a successful model should sort of say. If you had a model for the hippocampal formation and so on, and where obviously oscillations are prominent, then a successful biophysical based model of that should reproduce the oscillations. So for me, it's sort of like whether it's oscillations or something else. So that doesn't really change in terms of the modeling, even though it's what we've shown. I mean, but it's important we, for example, found that we have like for some of these hippocampal neurons, you have these resonances. I think that you can sort of get the largest. You get, how is it? I mean, you can get the typical sort of that largest LFP is at some, I think it's theta frequency or something like 8 hertz or something like that. Yeah. But anyway, so we saw that we could actually, in principle, that could be an artifact of how in some sense, how the IH is distributed. It's just like the IH messes up or changes the LFP. So it just illustrates that you have to be, when you see an oscillation, it doesn't necessarily, in an LFP, it doesn't mean that the firing rate necessarily is oscillating at the same time. Certainly not, you don't get the weighting right, at least. So you have to sort of you you have to do the measurement physics, right? So that's why it's really important, I think, to have this modeling framework, sort of as like a way to test your hypothesis. When you have an idea that, test whether it's like a firing rate thing versus like another thing that sort of sets up the oscillation. Because we have worked on this cable equation and neuron models and networks for a long time, and we have really spent a lot of time on this in our group, and we are still surprised by the predictions from the cable equation. And sometimes you have these intuitions that, then there should be a bump here, and then you do a simulation and then, no, it isn't, and then they go back and figure out why it isn't there maybe. But it's difficult to have intuition about how the signal should be. It's sort of it's all this what I call folk physics. It's sort of where people sort of, they saw like these rules of thumb, which are sometimes, which should be tested. And they sort of like, it's a little bit like spread from father to son or around the campfire in the neuroscience community.
Right.
So you have to test these things, right? For example, a thing that if you sort of measure strong local field potential in layer 4 in cortex, it doesn't mean that the neuron that generates that layer, LFP, has a soma in layer 4. So you don't have this locality that you have for spikes. So these are stills, you see sometimes meet this still. So it's just that it's some of these things have to be corrected. So I think it just can make the field more quantitative and precise, and help us when we sort of do this kind of measurement physics exercises to get sort of to at least not fail on that, because it's so many other things which are inherently difficult.
You mentioned the recent kind of explosion in focusing on low dimensional manifolds and the dynamics of populations of neurons. I mean, are there simulations that you do not long enough to connect with that, or how do you see that in general, and then do you think about that in terms of your own models and simulations?
Yeah. No, I think it's. If you think of, say, if you want to make this mouse visual cortex model, right? So you have this model with some 100,000s of neurons, and say if you measure in animals then you can measure these. Well, you measure receptive fields and selectivity and so on, and you can also measure these neural manifolds and experimental data. And then that's one thing that your model can be compared with, right? It's another sort of things that you compare. That's based on spikes. So it's another sort of like another thing that another kind of insight data that you can use to constrain your model. So that's so I think that's all these different measures that you can get that you can use which you think are important, is something you can use it to test your model. So then you will have sort of like this benchmarking test suit, right? If you sort of have this normal, you should predict this. How does it do on this sort of, how similar is it to whatever the present experimental data? And then you have a little bit like they have for this what's called the brain score. Is that what they have in the DiCarlo lab?
Brain
right?
score, I believe is,
yeah. So that is, if you get a similar thing, if you have a test suit, not with a single brain score, with some kind of multi-objective thing, and see how
high dimensional test scores. You got to reduce the dimension of those also.
Exactly. Yeah. But it just to be so, because I think that's why I think what I like about this overall project, for one thing, obviously I think it will be cool to really understand a piece of cortex at the level that you understand the neuron, right? That will be a very important thing, and I have so many but I also think so many applications and ramifications. But I also think it's because it's really a project or a program where we can make progress, because we can measure success, because we compare with different kinds of experimental data, and you can compare how well you're doing. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, we are far away from. That's certainly room for improvement in our models. I mean, this is like, I would say, early days, and we only worked on this for 2 years, and I hope that more people get interested in this. I mean, I think this experimental data set that they have in electrophysiology and optical physiology that they have freely available at the Allen Institute for these mice, which are sort of like 50, 60 mice, and they're the same age, and everything is sort of almost as reproducible as it can be, because it's
Right.
almost like this industry style lab. It's a fantastic opportunity for this kind of neuroscience. So this is which hasn't been there before. So I think it's really. So I hope there are some young, eager brains in whatever listening to this, U.S. or in Indonesia or Australia or in North Finland or in Norway or whatever. Now so we can sort of all this data is available for some sense for everyone with a laptop. And if you also get these sort of possibilities to do these large scale simulations from all these places, it's an enormous opportunity for neuroscience.
All right, Gaute,
And I would say just one thing I have to say, because it's the reason. I mean, Hodgkin and Huxley did essentially made this neural model by themselves, and ideally, I would also like to do the same thing for a cortex by themselves, for a piece of cortex by myself or in our group. So the reason we have these large scale initiatives like the Human Brain Project and others, and is really that it's collecting all this data and also just building this infrastructure for simulating things. It's just not the job for a single group. And also just making this what are called skeleton models, the candidate models, just putting up with some kind of plausible starting point. It's like many years. So it's a kind of approach. When you do this approach, the Hodgkin-Huxley style approach to say a network in the visual cortex, you need sort of like you need a large community, many people. So it's not like this collaboration has a value in itself, even though that can be fun also, but that's not really it.
That's something you also make the case for in that 2019 neuron perspective as well. So I'll point people to that also. Gaute, let's I want to switch gears and ask you one more question before we move on to some extra time for the Patreon supporters. And that's just kind of your broad thoughts about. So a lot of what we talk about on this podcast is the connection between deep learning and AI and neuroscience and cognition and brains. And I'm wondering how you view your simulation-based approach with respect to a deep learning approach to understanding brains and minds and cognition.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, very concretely, the goal of sort of my approach is really to mimic a piece of the brain. It's not really to at the moment, right? And hopefully then expand it to go beyond just the visual cortex to like a whole brain. So it has like a very different goal. On the other hand, I mean, it's now when if you want to sort of tune these parameters, I think, I mean, everything is allowed in love, war, and optimization. I mean, if you get some clues from AI in sort of how starting point for making these networks, say, so that get some extra hints, so that like the parameter space you have to search is smaller.
Right.
So I think and especially you have all this great brain power and of course the resources going into AI. So we have like a bio AI group also at our university. So I collaborate with some people there, also because it's fun, and but also because I think we need sort of I don't know. I think you talked a little bit earlier on an earlier podcast about we should be more charitable towards each other, and I think that's a very important thing. I think and I think we should be charitable is a good thing in general, but also in neuroscience, in this like the goal of and the task of trying to understand the brain, we don't have too many success stories, I would say. Right. I mean, it's not like clear. So I think if people, we should be very sort of open to other people's approaches, and unless people are doing something which are clearly unethical or like factually wrong. But who am I to tell? I mean, I pursue this like biophysically detailed thing, trying to modeling as a physical system, partly because I think it's promising, but also I think because it's something I know how to do because that's sort of what I've been trained, right? I'm trained as a physicist. You have to, if I figured out that what I really should do was monkey experiments, I mean, that would be the most promising. That would be helpless, right? I could never do that.
So, I'm sure you can teach an old dog new tricks, but there's a limit.
Yeah, there are limits. So I don't know. And then you have like maybe on the other extreme, you have like this, or other opposite, you have this Elias Smith with this other, what's called, right? And
Spawn,
I think
his
that
Spawn.
we should, Spawn, exactly. And we should just sort of root on each other and compare notes and see how we're doing. So we should be and I think AI also with the people working there trying to make connections to the brain. Excellent. We should just like what, for example, DiCarlo is doing and comparing there. That's exciting. So I think we should spend less time criticizing each other's approaches and just try.
Yeah. So the AI models, right, are still essentially built on neuroscience ideas from very, very early on, like point neuron kind of ideas, right? And are highly, highly abstracted. So in that sense, are at the opposite end of the spectrum of something like you're doing, creating these simulations. And do you hope and or think that the simulation-based approach might actually end up teaching AI something, or importing some principles into AI to help improve artificial intelligence, because it should in principle flow both ways, right?
I agree. Yeah, it could be. I mean, one thing that is, if you see these very successful deep learning applications, they are what it calls like single purpose. They're like category image classification, right?
Right.
And you're struggling with this transfer. It's not multi-purpose in the sense that it can be applied for many very different tasks. While the mouse visual cortex is used as input for dealing with many different tasks.
Yeah.
So maybe it's something with the neurons and maybe especially the temporal dynamics of real neurons, which are sort of not captured. Well, the deep networks is not captured at all. But with these artificial networks, that is crucial to get to this multi-purpose thing. So I think we should certainly, well, as we start hopefully make more progress along these biological networks, and we get towards this multi-purpose models, and I certainly think that it should be, well, that is something for the AI people to look at also.
So Gaute, thank you for the thoughtful email, which generated this conversation. I'll pass this on to Carina also. I'm sure she'll get a kick out of me having had you on the podcast. Yeah. And thanks for being with me today and sharing some of your work, and much luck moving forward.
Yeah, and well, thanks a lot for being invited. I really appreciate it.
I alone produce Brain Inspired. If you value this podcast, consider supporting it through Patreon to access full versions of all the episodes and to join our Discord community. Or if you want to learn more about the intersection of neuroscience and AI, consider signing up for my online course, Neuro AI, The Quest to Explain Intelligence. Go to braininspired.co to learn more. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. You're hearing music by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.